Okay. All right. I'm working off of my file, my Word document that I just randomly typed in my thoughts and feelings during the entire experience of playing the Hades 2 early access, inconspicuously called Hades Nuts 2. Hades 2 Nuts. But anyways, so not all of this. I haven't gone back and re-edited it. It's just kind of a stream of consciousness that I will be reciting and maybe adding in some further context for. But yeah, some parts of this I wrote when I was like only 5 hours in, etc. So, all right. First impressions of Hades 2 Early Access. I've put about 40 hours in so far. I've done most of the available content in this current build. My impression of the game so far? Some broad stuff, some quality of life stuff, some polish and glitches and stuff. I had a handful of glitches. I'll talk about that later. I rewrote about that later. Hang on, let me fuck this. I have no idea how much of this game is more or less in its final state. There's obviously unfinished content in here that is visibly unfinished, and placeholder. But I also don't know how much will be added in the parts that seem like they might be finished. Like in Hades 1, there were more variations on boss fights and mini bosses, not including the separate surface trek, which has its own bosses and stuff, but different variations on the Asphodel boss, etc. My very early impressions of this game were that I didn't really vibe with the game feel. I didn't like the feeling of the weapons that I was getting. I found the charged slow-mo magic stuff to be a weird choice for this kind of game. There are a lot of instances where, like, say if you take the knife weapons, your attack range is so fucking bad that a bunch of enemies will hit you with their own melee hits from well outside your strike range. So in certain encounters, there'll be a wall of you'll be in Oceanus, and there'll be like a wall of 10 spinning guys who will be floating towards you doing their spin attacks in this incomprehensible swarm of hitbox, and the knife, if it doesn't have the right buffs or boons or stuff to be functional, is just abjectly terrible at giving a good option in that situation, since it also, even if you were to dodge in the midst of a large group of people that are all clumped together, it doesn't have a very wide hitbox either, so it's difficult to clip all the enemies into hitstun that you would want it to. Anyways, in my brief experience with the game, not so brief now, I guess, I think that the knife probably has the shittiest moveset for certain situations. One of the issues I have with the game right now is that it can be really awkward to get Melanoe to aim at the correct enemy, which becomes very apparent when you're using weapons with extremely shallow hitboxes, like the flames, right? The flames only deal hit stun with the primary attack, not the special attack. So if you start shooting, but like Melanoe is aiming her little ice shard, whatever they are, flame diamonds at some guy 4 meters away instead of the guy right in front of you about to swing at your face that you want to interrupt with an attack, there's no way to get her to to switch aiming to the correct enemy. There's no way, because your movement is your aiming and you can't adjust it while you're actually doing the attacks. The knife suffers from a similar issue where you try to get in there, get enemies, but the knife hits are very small. It struggles to hit enemies directly to the left or right of you, and it struggles to aim exactly where you want it to go. Even with that, like the axe, if you swing at the end of a basic combo, even if you're holding the complete opposite direction, sometimes you can make her aim her attack in a different direction, or you can make her aim in the same direction but move in the opposite direction. It's fucking weird. I'm not sure what the solution would be in terms of the flames, because I don't remember having this problem in Hades 1. Usually, from what I recall, you could hit the enemies that you wanted to hit in Hades 1. The pivoting was better, the weapons had these nicer, wider hitboxes, I don't know. I do find a lot of the enemies to be pretty tanky. But I also feel like I would often, especially early on when I wrote this part of it, I would get remarkably bad RNG most of the time. Like, I did 15 fucking runs before the first time it even gave me the option to get Aphrodite's regular attack boon, which is plus 80% damage to nearby enemies, right? Even like without that, a lot of the time, I constantly found myself in situations where you're just pressing square over and over, waiting for the last enemy or two who you've completely stun locked, and you're just waiting for their massive health pool to slowly die. I would legit be in fights where I would just like look away from the screen, do something else, hitting a square with one hand in the controller, waiting for the fight to be over. Armor is kind of weird because some enemies have really tanky armor, but then some boons and some hammer upgrades that you get basically delete the concept of armor in the first place. So on runs where you get armor shredding tools, it totally flips the balance of some encounters. Even now, I'm often sabotaged mostly by my own boredom, because I'll be doing some run and tripping away at, like, Hecate, and I'll sometimes get hit once or twice because I'm very impatient that I want this fight to be over since I played it so many times already, and it's not hard and it's not interesting, but my DPS might be locked to like the sad, pathetic amount that it's locked at, especially with certain weapon types. I feel that as a general rule of game design, players should be able to do everything faster and significantly faster once they get used to it. Like how in Sekiro, you know, there's ways that you can... Like, there are mechanics that are designed for you to slowly fight enemies and chip away at their health pools, and that reduces their stamina, their posture recoveries and stuff. But also, if you're used to it and confident in it, you can blitz any enemy in like 25 seconds. If you just dump the perfect DPS while perfect parrying everything. You don't have to wait around, but in stuff like this, the enemies and bosses will inevitably do things that just force you to kind of hang out and wait for them to be done so you can keep playing. I understand that I have less patience than most people playing these kind of shit, especially on repeat fights and stuff. But if I'm fighting a boss that I've beaten like plenty of times and it's no real threat and it's no real challenge, it's not fun, it's not thrilling, I want to get it over with in like 40 seconds tops. I like the Siren boss fight. That's my favorite boss fight. Cerberus is pretty boring, but at least you spend most of the fight actually hitting him. The Cyclops is interesting, but I've fought him fewer times. Obviously, I've done the surface route fewer times since it's much less complete than the underworld route, but Cyclops is interesting, but if you don't have the right weapons and the right upgrades, boons by that point, it can be really goddamn slow because of how the things that he can do that shut down your active playtime. I think some of his hitboxes are bullshit, etc. Kronos, I don't know, maybe marginally more fun than Hecate, but he's also fundamentally kind of the same shit, and I think he's slightly bullshit in ways that Hecate isn't. So I was saying, like, game feel at first. I thought all the weapons sucked at first. Spear was fine, but less fun than Zagreus' default sword from the first game. Knife sucks in a lot of situations. The flames I thought sucked at first, and they kind of do in certain instances, but they're also kind of bullshit as well. Since then, I've come to appreciate the game feel more as I've gotten more intuitive with using the charged magic moves for all the weapons that I really wasn't doing that much when the first 2 hours of the game. I also sort of realized that the slow-mo effect that you get when charging an Omega action works similarly to the slow-mo in, ironically, those fucking FF7 remake games where you can conveniently charge a low-commitment action that will give you a slower vision of a fight unfolding, if need be. Which is not as useful as it was in those games, but I still like that concept of taking a real-time action game and having like snippets of slowing things down to get an instant snapshot into all the moving pieces. I still don't love the sheer time sink of constantly triggering slow motion actions to get anything done, especially weapons where your main DPS is just doing the slow-mo move over and over again. And something like the axe, where the slow motion, if you charge it to max and you don't have any upgrades or something, you're just sitting there charging for like 4 seconds straight to get to the max number of spins for the Omega attack. In some instances, I find the magic circle kind of cool, but I also prefer some of the mechanics of Zagreus' cast in the first game. I haven't played Hadeez 1 in quite a while, and while I did have criticisms of it, or more accurately, disappointments with the game in some ways, that I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I would, or felt like I would, or felt like other people were. But I recall the basic game feel being, I don't know, smoother, better, and that's probably polish. Again, I don't know how much of this is in its final state or not, so I'm not trying to judge the final product that doesn't even exist yet, but I felt relative to this, the weapons felt better and the movement felt better. You slid when you attacked more. There's a lot of instances in this game where it's like your only actions are, in a lot of instances, feel like keep attacking with one button or another, or dodge, because if you like try to attack and you don't want to do a full dodge, you just want to kind of walk a little bit, just for a microsecond, to the left or right or something, to reposition yourself or walk slightly closer to an enemy and then attack again. The game, it doesn't not really allow you to do that a lot of the times, because like as soon as you stop attacking an enemy, they instantly start triggering their attack immediately, and by the time that you walk even for 0.2 seconds and then swing your attack again, a lot of enemy types have already busted out, and you can take damage from that. Anyways, also, like, what the fuck happened to the mechanic from Hadeez 1 of knocking enemies into things? Like spikes and walls and stuff. They almost entirely got rid of knockback as an environmental factor. Now, hitting enemies doesn't knock them back unless you have certain buffs, and even if it does, they rarely have much benefit. There's also a more pervasive aspect. I just don't find most of the boons and buffs that you get to be very exciting. Like, I've been playing Balatro for fucking weeks now, right? And one of the core tenets of roguelikes, or whatever, or roguelites, or whatever the fuck people are calling it now, is seeing all the cool power-ups that you can potentially get, and the exciting possibilities of new power-ups you just unlocked that you haven't seen before, or the combination of applying power-ups, whatever. Whereas in this game, I'm not excited by the prospect of almost any of the weapons, or the boons, or most of the hammer upgrades. Some of the boons are very useful in certain situations, but I can still feel underwhelmed by them. Like, there's the dash that destroys projectiles. That shit is really useful in certain situations, because you can delete certain enemies' actions without them recovering from their action, but it's also unnecessary for a lot of the game, because you could have just played the game as intended and avoid the projectiles, and it doesn't feel cool. Almost all the boons and hexes, the hexes fucking suck. And like I'm seeing is just choosing between like which one I find the least repellent and useless a lot of the times. Only in rare circumstances do I get like a combination of tools that I feel like, yeah, this is doing shit. This is interesting, or this changes the way I play in a way that I am enjoying. Especially with weapons that have natural drawbacks from the knife, I don't feel like I'm buffing it to give myself cool shit that makes me like the knife. I feel like I'm buffing it just to give it tools that cover up for its gaping weaknesses of the situations that it's bad at. Yeah, so, like, at the end of the day, I still have the same broad criticisms of this that I did of Hadeez 1, which is in terms of my own personal enjoyment of the moment-to-moment action. I don't find most of the interactions in the game thrilling, and instead the game mostly feels like more or less slight variations of a very samey pattern of dodge back and forth of the enemy that has like one or two attacks and just keep doing it back and forth, or blast short DPS, rinse and repeat, run away to a better position. Some clusters are somewhat interesting. Some of the combat encounters in Tartarus can be a bit fun if there's like a billion different lasers on screen all the time and you have to navigate messy but still mostly manageable collection of projectiles. But most fights feel like the same general mildly boring corralling, the same all of the enemies' attacks, all their behavioral patterns and their attacks is just like all the enemies constantly just very simple enemy behaviors. They just move in your direction generally, spawn a projectile that just tracks you, and they naturally end up just clumping together in a big horde that you just kind of corral around in a circle, and that's a lot of the game. As with the prior game, most of the times I get hit, it's probably because of my own impatience, or rather my own boredom with doing the same basic actions over and over, and I get greedy trying to do more than I can in a certain amount of time just to speed shit up. Situations with convenient solutions, like if you lack the proper build or tools to deal with certain armored enemies in a small room, some of them can be difficult depending on your layout to avoid all damage. And I think most of the damage that you take in this game, other than just the basic process of learning the new encounters, because you're naturally just gonna take hits until you learn enemy types, learn encounter designs, learn the limits of your own toolkit, and learn boss behaviors and such. But I think most of the damage you take beyond that, those natural growing pains, is from lackluster game communication. Specifically, bad animations. There are some instances, like, if you're buying shit, like, from the well in a run, I noticed that it doesn't tell you on screen how much money you have. You would have to back out of that menu to see how much money you have and then go back into the shop screen, which is stupid. There's little stuff like that I'm sure they'll fix. Basic usability stuff. But mostly I just find this game, and like lots of modern games, but especially this one, to have kind of bad animations for expressing game function. I'm a purist. I think animations should express game function. I don't agree with the notion that, like, it's cool when animations don't tell you anything or, like, trick you by looking like they're going to do something. I don't really buy that methodology. So just like with Hadeez 1, right? Some enemies have attack ranges that are right outside your field of vision if they're, like, above your camera. So you can be hit by an enemy like Kronos with his lunging attack that you had no idea was about to happen because he was completely off screen. There's other enemies that have moves that can hit you from completely off screen, and by the time that they come on screen, they're way too fast for a human to react to them. I still maintain that the camera should be pulled back just a smidge, because enemies are designed so that you can see their max range start up if they're, like, to your left or your right, but not if they're up or down, given the aspect ratio. A lot of attacks just have, like, the bare minimum animations that really should be much clearer and much more apparent when seen in your peripheral vision, especially. Okay, take an example of bad animation for gameplay purposes. Cerberus, he has a lot of attacks where he pounds the ground, but instead of the attack being his actual animation striking the ground, or even the shockwave effect that is visibly clear when his paws first touch the ground, no. The actual hitbox of this attack is a second shockwave that appears from the point that his hands touch the ground after the first shockwave has already appeared and then dissipated for some reason. There's two shockwave animations, and the second one that is in no way connected to the actual timing of his animation of touching the ground is the actual attack itself. Once you get used to this, it's not that hard to dodge. Sometimes it's a little clunky, but my point is that the animation sucks because it visually communicates one thing, but the game function is totally different. I'm a big proponent of having clear animations that clearly express gameplay function, animations that are very easy for your eyes to identify, that communicate in common sense what the nature of an attack is going to be, where it's going to hit, how it's going to work, etc. If a boss has an attack, the animation should be abundantly clear. It should be very visually distinct from all of his other animations, so you can recognize at a glance, recognized by the silhouette. I'm a very big proponent of having good silhouettes for animations, of peripheral eyesight, etc. It should clearly imply what's about to happen, where it's about to hit, and the timing. Take Kronos, for instance. He's barely animated. A lot of Kronos and Eris, he's almost entirely just like T-posing. He's just like a floating guy. He's not very big. He's just holding one pose, he just floats around, and his arm kind of animates sometimes, slightly, and it barely affects his posture, and that indicates that he's about to attack and what his attack is. He has 3 different moves that if I showed you the startup animation, if you hadn't played him enough times, you would not be able to guess which of the attacks he's going to do, based on the mild kind of movements of his arms. Even if you can differentiate these shitty animations after playing him for enough times, it doesn't mean that it gets easier to see it in your peripheral vision, because all of his moves have very basic and samey silhouettes. You just hear him make like the same grunting sound effects if you have your headphones in. I often don't play with audio, just personally speaking, because I'm usually listening to other shit, podcasts and stuff, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that, like, his arm is like slightly rayed. Guess what move he's about to do. He has 2 moves that are very similar, that hit at very different timings. Also, enemies are constantly covered up by fireballs, particle effects, hit effects. If you're fighting then you will, if you're hitting him, you cannot see him at all. You literally have to back off, not because of any gameplay requirement to do so, but because you literally cannot see what he's doing if you're hitting him at all, because his tiny little body is completely covered by all the hit effects all the time. Just like these small, pathetic animations that are even harder to see clearly because they are constantly obscured. Let's take another example. One of the mini-bosses in Erebus, the one that has like the shadow effect, it has 2 moves. It smacks the ground, or it swipes at you. Now, once you get used to it, He just does the same moves back to back. He does one, then the other, in the exact same pattern every single time. But the smack the ground move has a very clear animation. He raises his bulbous mallet over the place he's about to smack, then smacks down on that place at a timing that mostly makes sense based on the animation. Fine. But his swipe attack has almost no animation at all, and the slight animation that it does have looks no different from when he is just turning to face you in your direction if you're behind him and off axis. Speaking of bad visual design for gameplay communication, it's only after watching other people play the game that I even realize that Hecate does her opening move, the first move that she does every time, with like the purple circle that expands and like the green flames all around it. It's only the purple ring that actually does damage, and you can dodge inside the purple ring and hit her and then dodge back out while it shrinks. The giant fucking green flames that are all around it and look like they're hitting everywhere, those giant green flames, they don't do anything. Even though they look almost no different from a bunch of her other attacks that are very similar looking green flames, where the green flames are an attack that you do have to avoid. So the complete inconsistency and the visual unclarity of this move meant that until I watched other people and realized that it wasn't an attack, I figured the flames were an attack, and I just thought, and I just didn't fuck with the circle because it's completely covered in these goddamn effects. Beyond that, the worst offenders of attacks that you get hit by that you can barely see before they hit you if it's messy or if you're not staring right at them, especially until you get used to it, the bouncing pink balls in the siren fight from the strings, which are just very small and they don't really like leap out in your eyesight if you're not staring at them directly. And they bounce in a weird pattern. But anyways. But it's like look at every other attack in the siren fight. gigantic pink circles that clearly indicate where the drummer is about to hit in these areas. Okay? Giant rings of very, very distinct flamey whatever, big music note projectiles, and then these like little tiny flatly colored bouncing little shits that sometimes appear on the screen. The floating clock enemies in Tartarus, they're another enemy. They spawn those circling fireballs that move so fast that by the time they even appear on your screen, you might not be able to react to them if they happen to be in a path that is going to collide with you. A lot of the times I just have to hope that I don't get clipped by some of those. Other than that, some enemies are just like a fucking snooze to fight, especially on repeat runs. Both mini-bosses in Erebus suck. They're boring. They're never fun to fight. It's never fun to fight. In no video game is it ever fun to fight a tanky enemy that has like 1 or 2 moves, and you just do the same thing over and over. Cerberus is kind of a snooze, but whatever. The Goldbag mini-boss in Tartarus is the king of tanky enemies with only 2 moves that makes you want to die from boredom. There's some collision issues in the game too. There's a lot of moments where you get caught on the environment in stupid ways. I'm pretty sure that they'll polish that up. Some whack hitboxes here and there, both with you and with the opponents. The laser hex has like the shittiest hitbox I've ever seen. I understand that seemingly most other people are more satisfied with the moment-to-moment gameplay, and they'll just like run around and do the same dodges and spam like projectiles for 20 seconds straight in one direction, and then turn to their face cam and exclaim how great the gameplay is. I'm just more easily bored than most people, and like, I need the basic expectations to be more interesting or exciting to me. At least I'd prefer other means of dealing higher DPS with more player involvement, basic corralling, basic dodging, poking enemies to death with a pin tack. Kinda lame, man. So yeah, just like Hadeez 1, my main observation, my main takeaway is, wow, excellent game. I wish I had fun playing it. I said back in 2020 that after I beat my first full run of Hadeez 1, the only time that I ever felt thrilled while playing the game again was when I beat 48 Heat. Or whichever the fuck one it is. I think 48 was the last one I did. Just like I explained in the last game, the problem is there's only a very thin line where something is actually intense and thrilling to play, just by how it works. So, when the basic gameplay is kind of just running around poking shit to death using very basic movement, very basic dodges, the enemies have very basic movesets, etc., and most of the damage you take is not because the game demands that much from you in any particular interaction, but just because some of the shit is animated badly, or hits at a weird timing, or hits from a hitbox off screen, or just, like, there's a lot of it, and eventually you might make a small error, or it's kind of clusterfucky sometimes. But in a game like this, you're rarely on like a razor's edge that makes it exciting. You're either in a situation where you steamrolled through shit no problem, at which point you would only take damage from weird surprises or freak fuck-ups, which may be your fault but isn't really very thrilling or fun. Or if you're in a situation where you just don't have the means to fight anymore because your build is just not fucking cutting it with a situation. So yeah, only in very rare moments are you actually doing anything clutch. Something that's just, like, barely possible under your current level of skill and ability and knowledge and whatever. As such, thrilling moments are very rare, and instead, doing runs feels much more grindy than actually fun. Like, if you get into a bad spot in a run, you might be able to clutch this encounter, but what about the next encounter? You could have also just, unless you beat the full run, what does it really matter? You could have also just died and just started a new run and got a better build and then cleared well past this point, no problem. So once you're at the point where you can mostly reliably beat Chronos every run that you do, the only way to get thrill from the game, speaking from experience with Hadeez 1, would be to get the exact right combination of heat, or fear in this game, that specifically pushes you to the limits of your abilities, but is not complete bullshit enough or super reliant on RNG. So, as you can imagine, getting that perfect combination of elements to form a satisfying challenge is pretty rare. It's a very thin line. Balatro has much more of a feeling of clutch, and also just, like, the things that you build are more interesting and fun in that game. But it also wastes less of your time, because if you're steamrolling, you don't have to think about what you're doing. You can just clear shit in like a couple seconds. You can play as fast as you are overpowered in whatever you're currently doing. And Balatro is more fun to manage your build and to run for anyways. Balatro doesn't suffer from gatekeeping certain advantages to the long-term buffs that, like, this game has with the Arcana system, or leveling up your keepsakes or getting more grasp or whatever. Balatro is like a true roguelike where you get no permanent benefits. You just unlock new things that might appear in a run. It's hard for me to really explain where I'm coming from, because like I can't really put my finger on why Hadeez 1 and 2 feel kind of snoozy and not fun. I don't think they're unfun. I just think that they're not fun. I'm not thrilled while playing them. But I enjoy other action games like Lies of P, for example. Part of it is game feel, I'm sure. Part of it is the micro challenges. Like, Lies of P demands more from you in the smaller moments, because the parry window is very small and precise, whereas Hadeez has this really broad dash, tons of invuln. You only really get hit due to mistimes, or a lot of time bad animations or clusterfucks, or just like dumb errors caused by impatience, or like really fucked up particular situations. Which also isn't an issue in other games where you have the freedom to engage with fights at your own pace rather than by the enemy's pace. I think parrying helps in that way, because dodging in a game like Hadeez is kind of just feels like a waste of time a lot of the times, whereas like back and forth strikes and parries in a game is you constantly engaging with and damaging the enemy. If I'm waiting out some big AoE in Hadeez to be done, I'm kind of just looking at my watch waiting for the game to let me play again. Just the sheer sameness and emptiness of the constantly repeating pattern in Hadeez of dodge, poke, 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 dodge, whatever, slam your fucking DPS, whatever you have in your kit currently against them. It's so loose that nothing you do matters beyond these broad, simple actions, and you can kind of boil most encounters down to the same general game plan. The only exciting parts of the combat, other than applying fear to make the runs a genuine challenge, is when shit gets really complex with a lot of enemies, and only very rarely, because shit getting too complex in Hadeez 1 and 2 can get so messy that you basically can't even see what's happening anymore. So that also doesn't feel like a satisfying challenge, just like vaguely managing a big clusterfuck with your own clusterfuck management tools that you have, and hoping that you don't accidentally get clipped by one of the myriad things that's flying around you constantly. I've felt zero sense of thrill or clutch in this game so far. Every kill on Kronos that I got, it was without losing a single death to find the run. It's way too easy to regen health in this game compared to Hadeez 1, where runs would actually kind of grind you down over time. It wasn't impossible for you to... Whereas, there's no excitement in the gameplay. It's just like, do the run, kill Kronos, whatever. Maybe it's because Hadeez 1, the game is basically just Hadeez 1, but kind of slightly worse in many ways, except for the existence of the surface route, which offers some things, I guess. But I felt the tinge of boredom way faster playing this than I did with Hadeez 1. I would be playing runs and fighting some boring room of mobs or some boring tanky boss and just be like, damn, I kinda want to be doing something else right now. When I'm hitting one enemy and just mashing square, waiting for them to die, I'm like, damn, these hype-ass gameplay, hitting one button. I've only done a handful of surface runs. I've only done like 10 or so, but it's clearly less complete and less polished currently. Just like, whatever. I had some, I think not just in terms of the clear content that it's missing, but also I feel like the design of the fights is less polished. Like, I think both boss fights in the surface route are really shitty compared to the underworld ones, which I don't even really like that much either. I think the two available bosses, they're really clunky. Cyclops sucks because of the terrible auto-tracking in his animations and his stomp moves and such. Totally unclear how far he's going to rotate. He has a lot of shit. He has a lot of moves that waste your time. He has very abrupt animations. They don't visually... His move that if you're close to him and he suddenly leaps into the air, he can sometimes rotate all the way in your direction and it suddenly deals damage in a very unclear hitbox. That happens very quickly. Yeah, I don't know. The Eris fight is by far the worst, though. Yet again, another character with bad animations. She barely animates to express her gameplay function. A lot of her shooting animations look identical to each other. But the real shit stain on this fight is the fact that she has a lot of moves like Kronos and like other enemies and like other trends in video games that I hate, where an enemy doesn't attack, where they just hold one animation, they pause in that animation, and then eventually they're going to swing instantaneously and you won't be able to see it. You just have to kind of play it by feel of when you think the attack will actually trigger, because they just don't animate them fluidly, at least. So she has a lot of that shit, but yeah, I mean, she constantly does moves that shoves herself into corners or into positions or like sitting in a pool of fire, where sometimes you can't even dodge her next attack, because if you were to dodge past her, which is necessary for some of her attacks, you would inevitably dodge into the puddle of fire and then take damage from that. And there's some really clunky shittiness with her constantly shoving herself into walls. I've encountered 4 clear glitches in my play. One very obvious visual glitch where the animation was clearly not even slightly close to the hit effect. I've noticed that the freeze status effect glitches enemies out pretty frequently, because it can cause them to indefinitely loop attacks that are only supposed to hit once. I had one instance where using my hex that summons a dead enemy to fight for me broke an encounter because the game could not recognize that all the enemies were already dead. This happened in Tartarus after summoning one of the big rat wrangler guys and after I killed all the other enemies. And then I had another instance where I was doing one of those things where you get the money, you get like the 100 golds, and you fight like a single wave of enemies and kill them as fast as possible. Again, similar situation. I didn't even use a hex this time. There was nothing. It's just that the game somehow miscalculated and thought that there were 2 enemies left alive after I had killed everyone. And I had one actual hard crash in the fields. It's been literally years since the last time a game hard crashed on me, so it can't come as a surprise to me. I've also had minor glitches like enemies getting stuck in walls where I couldn't hit them through normal means, or lots of bad collision interactions. I find some of the projectiles that just move so slowly and track so absolutely to be really annoying for hanging around enemies and not giving great opportunities to get close and hit them too consistently, especially when you're restricted to certain weapons or actions that might not be amazing for all situations. A lot of the game comes down to just corralling and running around. I think a lot of the hexes suck ass. They're not cool. They're not very helpful. The laser and the dive, I feel, are particularly bad, and any of the hexes you can eventually buff to get other benefits or to serve some relative function, but that takes 2 or 3 of getting the same boon that only benefits hex and nothing else, which is, I feel, far worse than getting actual boons. Ironically, for a game about killing Kronos, I think the worst thing in the game by far is the sense of time for its gameplay functions. When you do slow motion moves, Kronos is affected by the slow-mo, but for much less time than other enemies are, seemingly. He can break out of it very quickly. When you hit an enemy with a bunch of attacks and the hit stop occurs, it seems completely random how the game will interpret the passage of time for their actions. Like, I would fight that fucking sea serpent mini-boss in Oceanus. I would just swing at him, and then every time I hit him, it pauses his animation because of the hit stop. And then I want to dodge through his melee attack swipe at the right time, but it is totally unclear when his attack is actually going to happen, because while you're hitting him, his animation gets frozen in the hit stop at the point where it stays right in the final part of the animation, and you cannot actually tell how much time is passing in his attack startup. So sometimes you can hit him a bunch of times, and then you're like, okay, he's been paused in this animation for so long because of the hit stop, he has to almost be ready to attack now, and then you dodge and it's still too early, and then sometimes you're like, okay, I don't know, and it'll be too late, and it's just totally shitty. Kronos especially seems to constantly animate at different speeds and hit at different timings, especially when you're hitting him. I knocked out a quick 8 fear run, but then I realized that it won't actually give you the Skelly statue until you complete the fear level on both the underworld and the surface routes, which means that I don't feel like it can be done honestly until the full game release, since surface is not done. It's only half finished right now. It kind of fucks with your statistics in a way, because in this early access build, it qualifies as beating a run if you just kill Eris, which means that you can get absurdly low run times in your stats for your weapons and stuff because you're playing an unfinished version of the game. I just hope that they delete those stats when the full game comes out. I don't want my save file to continue to say that I did a run with the goddamn flames in like 18 minutes. Overall, I have no current opinion on the fear system. Just based on my 8 fear run that I did for the underworld route, it was just as effortless as a normal run. I can imagine probably doing up to 24 fear without too much trouble or putting in any real effort. It'll probably get harder once I'll have to turn off the Arcana cards. The thing is, this game compared to Hadeez 1, the run itself is so fucking easy, largely because there's so many ways to keep yourself healed, and like, it's not a war of attrition anymore. You can stay at full health almost all the time. And even if you take a lot of damage before the end of the run, you can heal it very easily. And like, by far and away, the most lethal thing in the game, in the run, is Kronos. Nothing else compares to his damage output and the ways in which he attacks and such. So my 8 fear run was based on choosing options that would not really affect the Kronos fight, but once you get into higher fear, that will inevitably have to make Kronos harder, I could see the difficulty getting higher at that point. All that being said, this is probably my game of the year so far, competing with Balatro and Murders in the Yangtze River for the spot, and I'm going to play other things like Animal Well soon. That's about it. See ya.